Welcome, everyone.
Hello.
As you come in, if you could just even put in the chat who you are and where you're from. We have lots of people coming from all over today, so it's kind of fun to see. Yay, Ontario, Canada. Woohoo. Our international guests. And you're all locked down and having nothing else to do but watch Science of Reading. Good to see everybody.
We'll start in about 1 minute.
Lisa, I'm not sure what the rule is, why people in our neighborhoods need to do yard work when we have presentations, but I now hear a chainsaw outside.
Today's Wednesday. I think we're good. My problem in my neighborhood is Tuesday, but you might hear my children playing with the other neighborhood kids outside. So I apologize in advance. And if anyone happens to ring our doorbell, you will hear my dogs barking as well. So again, I apologize in advance.
Where we all are living right now. All right, we have a couple more people coming in, but I think, Lisa, if you go ahead to the next slide. I'd like to welcome everyone to our session. You have probably heard by now that this is day 3 of a 4-part series, and you still have one more day next week to come and hear the end note with Anita Archer, which will probably be fantastic. So you are welcome to come to that next Wednesday. Closed captioning is available if you click that at the bottom. The recordings are all the sessions are recorded, and there are recordings from all of the previous days that we had in February and March, and all of those are available on our website. The recordings for today will be available in a couple of days. The presentation materials are available in the Google Drive link for the session in the digital program where you, yes, Jamie?
I don't see the closed captioning. Do you have that turned on?
Let me see.
And because I didn't originate the meeting, I can't turn that on.
You see it now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. If you have questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. We will try to get to them all at the end. Because right after this session, the rest of our team has facilitated team times and Lisa and I do not, we are willing to stay extra long at the end of this 75-minute session if you want to talk more about implementation of MTSS or Science of Reading or your favorite bread recipe. We're going to hang around at the end if you would like to, because we have some time being in this last time slot. Okay, go ahead, Lisa. So first, I'd like to introduce us. My name is Beth Ferguson, and I'm here with my colleague, Lisa Bates. We are implementation coaches with Oregon Response to Instruction and Intervention. Oregon RTI is we offer technical assistance to districts who are building, implementing, improving, and sustaining MTSS systems. And our vision with Oregon RTI is that every child in every district receives the instruction that they need and deserve every day. And we really have primarily a focus on elementary literacy because we believe that literacy is a civil right. And if you heard this morning's keynote, I'm sure that this is a powerful message that is foremost in your mind today. But we also believe that in order to achieve high levels of literacy for all students, we need to support staff. So we also believe that every teacher has the right to the knowledge, the skills, tools, coaching, and support to teach children how to read and write. As we heard again this morning, it is not innate. We need to teach them. And so we need the tools and skills to be able to do that. Most of us did not learn how to teach in the way that science tells us we should teach. That at least was my experience when I became a teacher. And when I first started teaching second grade, I didn't know this stuff. I know better now, and I still have kind of some regret about things I didn't do when I was in the classroom or in the past in second grade. And I know I could do better now. So thank you for joining us today in an effort to make better outcomes for all students. Earlier today, during the opening, we asked you to consider how this definition of the science of reading, well, the preamble to it, kind of informs your why for today. And the highlighted areas that I've highlighted on this slide really are about our why. So we believe that a robust MTSS based in that evidence-informed science of reading will ensure that most children can be taught to read the first time and provides a safety net for those students who don't. And so that is our why for why we are doing this presentation today. Okay, go ahead. After this session today, you'll hopefully be able to reflect on how your current MTSS or RTI for reading practices could be improved by better alignment with the science of reading. We're going to give you a few tools to support that alignment, and you'll know some next steps for improving reading instruction. I will say that what we're going to talk about today is primarily about elementary systems, but many of those system pieces will apply in secondary also. But primarily, we're going to be talking about elementary reading. What this session will not be, it is not in 75 minutes and we are good to go to implement science of reading and MTSS tomorrow, right? This is long, hard work. But this is just kind of an overview. The other thing I want to add is that those tools that we're going to provide to support your alignment, there's a little caveat there because like we talked about this morning, this is a field of really exciting research. Some of these tools are going to evolve and change as we learn more about how reading works and how reading instruction should be happening in classrooms. So those tools will evolve. So keep in touch with Oregon RTI to see always our latest iterations of those things. Okay, go ahead. So how do we get started? Implementing and sustaining robust systems takes time, and this work needs to be done system-wide. This graphic from the Reading League really helps us to reflect on our systems, and so throughout the presentation today, you'll have an opportunity to really think through how do we need to invest in knowledge building for the people in our system? What do we need to do to anchor reading instruction in the scientific evidence base? And then really importantly, what do we need to let go of? What do we need to abandon in order to make this change? Because we can't just keep piling things on top of teachers and staff of new things to do, new things to try, without letting go of some of those practices that are not effective. Okay. Other sessions today will help you get deeper into the science of reading and deeper into some instructional practices for both word reading and language comprehension. And then some other sessions talk a little bit more about how to lead this move. So the whole day is really about how to improve your MTSS based in the science of reading. We're just going to give you a little framework to attach that to. And like I said, this is 75 minutes. And for us to talk about something that takes 4 to 5 years or more to really implement. So as you hear this today, you may be like this little dog and be listening with interest and you may be nodding your head here and there. You may even be ready or be inspired to make a leap to a more effective system, jumping up in the air. I'm good to go. But this is hard work. And there may be times because we're always in a cycle of improvement where you may feel like, oh my gosh, I can't do this anymore. But I think the message that I got this morning from Steve's keynote is we just can't quit. We have to keep going because these are kids' lives that are at stake. But pause once in a while, take a little nap, and then wake up and keep doing the work. Throughout the presentation today, you'll see this little chat icon, and we will try to have some places to engage in conversation in the chat. This symbol is also here if you are going to watch this presentation asynchronously. So if you are watching this kind of like on the DVR version of it later, this will be when you see these symbols, those would be really good places to pause and talk with your team about sort of where your system is, what changes you might need to make. And these are really good places to have deeper conversations. All right, so we first have a quick poll. And first question, it's actually two questions. So in learning about where are you in your system, or where are you personally in learning about how the science of reading informs instructional practices? Are you just beginning, or you know enough to know that some of the practices and materials you've been using are not so aligned? Maybe you're working on improving reading instruction, or you feel like materials that you have are supporting you. And then same thing with the question about MTSS. Where are you kind of in your setting? Thanks to those of you who are putting some good information in here. Okay. So good. It looks like most people are kind of in that building a system and doing some implementing. You know, of course, you're always improving and sustaining, but that's good information. Jamie, if you want to just share the results. Oh yeah, you did. So thank you. All right. Well, we know what to do. So let's get this work going. Thank you so much for putting that information in the poll. Just wanting to see where you all kind of were. All right, Lisa.
Okay, so we thought we'd start this next section with just a little cartoon first. So it says, well, I guess it's inevitable that a few people will fall through the cracks. So obviously this is the opposite of what we want to have with our students that we're teaching. We don't want them to be falling through the cracks. We want to be preventing them from falling through the cracks. And even if with our best efforts, if they do fall through the cracks, we then want to know how to get them out of the cracks. So a system that can help us to do this is our MTSS system. And today we might use MTSS and ORTIi interchangeably. Our charge with Oregon Department of Education is to focus on the literacy side of MTSS. So therefore, sometimes we just refer to that as ORTIi, which is also shown by our name, ORTIi. Sorry, our pictures are in the way of ourselves. Okay. So I thought also it'd be nice to have just kind of a shared definition of what MTS is. So we took this definition from CORE. We thought it was a good one. There's other ones out there, but they're all fairly similar. And this one says it's a multi-step process to provide instruction and supports to promote the academic and behavioral success of all children. So it's really a systematic way of providing that support in varying levels of intensity so children can be successful. It has four kind of key components: the multi-tiered levels of prevention and support. Those are tier 1, 2, and 3. But what's crucial to making those effective is using evidence-based programs with high quality instruction. So that's what we'll dig in a little more to today with how to align your systems with using the science of reading, because that's what's going to make it more effective and have that high quality instruction. And then there's also ongoing assessment and database decision-making and problem solving. We absolutely need assessment to be able to make decisions at various levels. We need it at the district level, but we also need it at the school, the grade level, a group of student intervention level, and at the individual student level. And one caution here is sometimes you might have heard the phrase data rich and information poor. we want to make sure that you're using the right assessments and asking the right questions, so you're not just having too much data and don't know what to do with it. We want to be strategic with our decision making. So the question we get asked a lot is MTSS an equitable system? And I think it's helpful then to first dive into what actually is an equitable system mean? And we're going to take a look at it for what is equity in education. And the definition that comes up when you look for that, it says equity in education requires putting systems in place to ensure that every child has an equal chance for success. So that's saying that we need to diversify what we do for students and provide different levels of intensity for them to give them that chance for success. We know all students don't learn just at the same way. We need to be able to provide additional supports for them. Now let's look at a definition of an equity-based MTSS. We took this definition from Amy McCart and Dawn Miller, their book on leading equity-based MTSS for all students. It is a great resource. We would highly recommend that you get it, and it looks like this. Oh, sorry. Well, I'm trying to show it to you, but my background is not letting me. So the definition from Amy and Dawn says that equity-based MTS uses a structure, and it has people collaborate together, bringing their knowledge together from the context that they're working in, the science, that science of reading, and their systems. And they use that to create positive results for all students. So that's key. And then they also further explain that you're using data sources to inform those decisions, and you're coordinating the supports that you provide to students in academics, behavior, and social emotional supports. And that's done so you can meet the needs of each and every student. So that definition of an equity-based MTSS really sounds a lot to me like what is equity in education. So we can say that MTSS is an equitable system because we are doing everything we can possibly can to give all students the chance for success. So now we're going to dive into what an MTS framework looks like. And as Beth said, we kind of continuously evolve. This is a new involvement for us. We've kind of created a new graphic, and I think you probably are the first to get to see the unveiling. So the first kind of big plate that everything lies on is your infrastructure and capacity. And the inclusion and equity. And so those are your foundation for everything. We want to make sure that people have the mindset that do all staff believe all students can learn and learn at high levels. How are we going about that? How are we supporting that mindset and growing it? But that then needs to sit on some structures. And all MTSS systems, whether it's academic, behavior, or social and emotional, will kind of have these structures to it. You're going to use data. You're going to have collaborative database support planning. That's your teaming structures to make use of the data. And you're going to have instruction and supports to be able to help students to benefit from the supports that we're giving them. And then to make that work further, we're going to layer on infrastructure and capacity and community and family partnerships. Infrastructure and capacity are key. We need to make sure that do we have too many initiatives and they're not aligned, they're working at cross purposes, or maybe initiatives are aligned, but we have so many that we're putting too much funding into too many different things. So do we have a central focus? And the capacity is, are we growing our staff? As kind of Beth pointed out in the beginning with the definition is we need to grow our staff to be able to implement evidence-based practices so we can get the most bang for our buck, but we need to support them in doing that. And then community and family partnerships are absolutely key as well. We can't do this without our family partners and our community partners. They bring such rich information to us about what is happening in their lives and their community to make our supports more effective. So we don't want to forget about bringing them into our planning. So, and then for the, so then we're going to narrow it down to our framework. And as I mentioned, with our charge is more to focus on the literacy side. So as you can see here, those structures are linked to kind of different levels or different supports for, sorry, my voice is going, for what data you will use, for what teaming structures you will use, and what instructions and support you will provide. And we'll go into each of these. Today, we're going to try to cover all three tiers. but with time, we might not get to be as deep into tier 3, and we'd rather spend our time going into tier 1 and tier 2. Not that tier 3 is not important, but we just want to make sure that we cover the earlier, more preventative pieces. So then there's some misconceptions. You've maybe said or heard, we probably have said some of these things in our past, but these are crucial to that, to making RTI successful and having the right mindset that I talked about with that culture inclusivity. So one of the misconceptions is that RTI is getting students into special education. That is not true. RTI is your whole system, as we saw before. It's not just the end part of it. It's not the hoops you have to get through to get kids into special education. When we have that mindset, it tells us that special education is the only way to solve kids' needs. That's not true. We can prevent it, and we can provide them support much earlier in the process. Another thing is RTI is another name for Title I. That's the same thinking there. RTI is not just your intervention system or Title I system. It's your core instruction. It's those interventions. It's problem solving. It's a much bigger system. And then you might have heard or said that RTI is a room or a place, a time, or a student. And RTI is not those things. It's not the RTI room or don't have the RTI time in your schedule, because it's, again, RTI is the whole day. It's not just a period of time or place kids go. And it's not a student. And sometimes we're totally guilty of saying these things, a tier 2 kid or a tier 3 kid. But the message we're sending about that is we're inadvertently labeling them. And that can create some difficulties as we try to support them. So we want to understand that it's not a tier 2 kid or a tier 3 kid, it's tier 2 supports. It's what we do to the kid to help them to be more successful. It's not the kid. All of RTI is about, again, our adult actions to be able to support students. And we know that when RTI is done well, it actually works. So there's a lot of research on it, and you may or may not have heard of John Hattie, but he does a lot of studies, which are called meta-analyses. And really what that means, it's a study of studies. And so when he looked at studying RTI with studies that met certain criteria to make sure they were good studies, he got an effect size of 1.29. So typically in education, we say a good effect size is 0.4. So an effect size of 1.29 is huge. So we know when we do it well, it works. Even then, also the International Dyslexia Association, they have their knowledge and practice standards, and that RTI is embedded in those standards, particularly in that assessment piece. So with all that, then we need to kind of ask ourselves, why do we still struggle to teach all students to read at not a proficient level, but an advanced level? When we know RTI can work, we're still sometimes want to get better results. So how can we do that? And that's what we're going to focus on today.
And so if we know that RTI is supposed to work, and that and we are still struggling to get kids that gift of literacy that we talked about earlier this morning, I think some of that struggle of why it's not working well comes from the fact that we as teachers may or may not have been taught when we learned to be a teacher how reading works. So on the next slide, we have a reminder of what is the science of reading. So because this is a reading conference, even though I know you are all muted, I would like for us to do a choral read of this definition so that we really have these words in our head. So go ahead in your own private space, go ahead and read this aloud with me. The science of reading has culminated in a preponderance of evidence to inform how proficient reading and writing develop, why some have difficulty, and how we can most effectively assess and teach and therefore improve student outcomes through prevention of and intervention for reading difficulties. Thank you. I know you all did a great job reading. I appreciate it. So we talked about this morning also. It's decades of research, right? In this science of the reading science. It is actually around multiple languages. So it's not just how you read in English, but it's how you read in other languages as well. It's across scientific disciplines. We saw that big long list this morning. And at this point, because we live when we do, it's also about functional MRIs that can look into the brains of kids who are proficient readers and kids who have reading difficulties and see kind of what the difference is. So I am not a brain surgeon. I am not a brain scientist. Other people explain this much better than I do. So I encourage you to seek out some videos. We have a good presentation in the folder that explains this really well. So I'm going to give you the really short version of the research. And that is that we aren't wired to read, right? And Steve talked about that this morning. It is not innate. We have to build pathways, like everywhere where you see those little lines there on that picture of the brain, those are the pathways that we need to build to connect print to speech to meaning. And effective reading instruction builds those pathways so efficiently, actually, that it seems like we read by sight, but we don't. It's just that is so quick after we've built those pathways and made them really, really firm and efficient and well trod. It seems like we're reading by sight. So, but it's really important to recognize that we have to process words. Everybody does this. And how we teach matters. We know that effective reading instruction changes the brain, even in students with dyslexia and other reading difficulties. So this is what we need to be doing. So if we take this brain and simplify it, right? You've seen probably already in a couple sessions today, the simple view of reading, that reading is about word recognition, or that reading comprehension is the product of decoding or word recognition and language comprehension. And all of that, if one is low or zero, either decoding or language, you're not going to be able to comprehend what you read, right? So it's actually not quite that simple, which we probably know. Again, back to Scarborough's reading rope, and this is the 20th anniversary of this rope. So this is not new. It may be new to some of us, but it is not brand new. But the simple view really is quite complex. And we need that systematic and explicit instruction in all of the areas of the reading rope in order to become proficient readers. And explicit and systematic instruction in the word recognition skills. And as we become more strategic and more accurate with that, it gets tighter and tighter. And then same thing with the language comprehension. We need explicit and systematic instruction in background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, all of those things need systematic and explicit instruction. So what does this look like in a lot of core programs? You may have heard about that the science of reading informs what should be taught and how it should be taught. So the what is really, in a simple version, those 5 pillars of reading. So phonemic awareness, the sounds of words, phonics, decoding and encoding, so reading and spelling, fluency, which is not about reading fast, it's about accuracy, rate, prosody, and then comprehension. And I almost forgot vocabulary. And in vocabulary, it's that academic vocabulary, story vocabulary, content area vocabulary, and just all of these 5 pillars of reading being woven together all the time, not just in the language arts block, but really throughout the day. The best way to continue to build vocabulary and comprehension is to keep coming back to those things and having, like if you look on the structured literacy side, explicit instruction, for example, in vocabulary, even in science, even in math. So building those vocabulary structures for kids. So on the how side, we have structured literacy, which is explicit instruction. So lots of modeling, the I do, we do, you all do, you do, systematic and cumulative. So not leaving to chance which skills kids get, but being really systematic and cumulative, so that even over 1 year, we know what's going to be taught, and over the course of 5 years in elementary school, or 6 years, we know what's going to be taught. Lots and lots of practice with feedback. Again, you have to keep going back to that model of the brain and understanding that we're building pathways, and it's practice with feedback. And the reason why we need the feedback is because we don't want to practice incorrectly. So we want to give that corrective and positive feedback frequently. And then our another part of structured literacy is it needs to be responsive. And we need to be making those teacher moves all the time to be responsive to the kids' needs. Okay, go ahead. You may have said or heard a couple of these. I'm not going to read through all of them, but we already talked about this one today. Science is a pendulum swing, it will go away. Nope, we're going to refine it. We're going to continue to research and learn and keep abreast of what works best. But science is science, it doesn't go away. Another one I want to point out that a lot of people say, well, I do teach phonics. I teach phonics or phonemic awareness or sounds when I'm conferencing with kids. But the issue there is incidental phonics instruction doesn't ensure that kids have all of the skills that they need. You know, what if the book they're reading doesn't have R control vowels in it? And somehow over time, you haven't really taught that explicitly. They're not going to know what to do when they encounter that sound. So it's not enough to just kind of do the random acts of phonics instruction. It needs to be systematic and explicit. Another thing we hear a lot is that if children choose their own books, or if they struggle and become readers on their own, then it's going to be engaging. Well, students will be engaged in the books if they know how to read them, right? And productive struggle is mostly frustrating when it comes to reading. I've heard people say that they sat there and looked around the classroom and wondered how other people knew this code and they didn't. Right? And that's not fair. We want to explicitly teach all kids how to read. There's lots of things you can struggle in life, but figuring out the code of reading should be something that's not a mystery to you. It should be taught. Okay, go ahead. So just quickly in the chat, I'm wondering if something we have said about either MTSS or the science of reading affirms what you know so far, or is there one aha that you've had so far that you would that resonates with you in your setting that you would want to put in the chat? I don't know if we have big chatters in this group, but if you want to write something, you may. Yeah, thank you, Barbara. That, you know, I've seen a visual of creating those neural pathways that was a kid riding a bike down a path. And the first couple times you ride it, you can wobble around on that path, but the more you ride down that same path, like if you've ever been on a mountain bike trail, those pathways are pretty set and it's hard to fall off of the pathway. So you want those to be really solid pathways. Yeah, Debbie, that's totally true. We are every day we learn something new about all of this. Thank you guys for engaging in the chat. I really appreciate it. Okay, so oops, go back one, Lisa. So why is it essential that your RTI system be grounded in the science of reading? I've been thinking a lot about this, and over the past couple of years, I feel like we've gotten much better when we're talking about behavior, PBIS, social emotional learning, trauma-informed practices. We've done a really good job of tying brain science into those areas of MTSS, right? We understand that trauma impacts the brain, or that how brain development works. And we're starting to use some of those practices as we're developing our PBIS systems, for example. So it's really important that we bring the science into the MTSS for reading system as well. And understanding why effective reading instruction based in what science tells us works best is kind of that brass ring of the center of your MTSS system. It's the key piece. So why is it essential? If you recall in that science of reading definition, we understand that MTSS and RTI are really at their core about prevention of reading difficulties. And MTSS, like Lisa said, gives us that framework for using data to continuously ask if what we are doing in our reading instruction is causing learning, and adjusting when it doesn't. either for the whole group or for individual students. And so if we know this, I really wonder sometimes why, Lisa, go ahead. Why aren't we here yet, right? If we know that 95% of children should be able to be taught to read by the end of the first grade, why aren't we there? If RTI is a system of prevention and differentiated supports has been around a long time, why haven't we solved all these problems? Why are we still struggling to teach all students to read at an advanced level? Why do we still have this epidemic of low literacy? And I have seen school data, or I've seen individual classroom data where teachers have gotten their first graders, 95% of the class is a proficient reader, or even 100% of the class. It is relentless work. And one of the things, though, that is you can have those individual pockets in a school where you have super high rates of proficiency, but it needs to be equitable. It shouldn't be up to kind of what we sometimes call the teacher lottery, that you just got really lucky to get Mrs. So-and-so this year, and so you learn to read in first grade. It needs to be that every kid in your whole district has that opportunity to receive the best reading instruction based in what we know works. And MTSS can kind of give us the framework for doing that. Well, so one of the reasons why we're not there yet is because the truth about systems is that they are perfectly designed for the outcomes they get. So the outcomes we're getting are a result of the systems that we have. So if we're not getting the outcomes that we want, we need to look at why. And a lot of that does come down to some of those flawed ideas about reading. Flawed ideas, and a lot of these actually Steve shared this morning, so I'm not going to go into them quite as much, but just about how kids learn to read, the best method for teaching them how to read. And then the one I really want to focus on this is educators' need for continued support. When we left our college prep program, we thought we were ready to teach kids how to read, or we thought maybe the people that I work with will help me teach kids how to read. But the real fact is that a lot of us were taught some of these flawed ideas. And so we ourselves have that need for continued education, continued knowledge and support in developing our own practices. And so that time is really overdue for us to continue to anchor in those best practices and abandon the ineffective one. And a system-wide MTSS that's grounded in the science of reading can give us a framework to do that. Okay, go ahead, Lisa.
So now we're going to dive into the different tiers and how the science of reading can make them, can enhance them. So we have this as a table. And Jamie, I can't see the chat, so I'm not sure if you've put our folder in the chat or not. But if you,
I did.
Okay, thank you. And so, so this is a table we have that just describes the different tiers, and really we have this arrow on the side to show kind of how the science of reading is infused throughout all the tiers. We'll go into each tier more in depth when we talk about each tier, which we're going to do now with core or tier 1. So this is what that table shows us for tier 1. And we can call it tier 1, or I might refer to it as core instruction. We're talking about the same thing. And what's important to know about tier 1 or core instruction is that it is designed for all students. All students should receive core instruction. There may be a few little outliers, but 99% of students should be receiving core instruction. So that means we don't have pull out for kids to receive interventions during core instruction. We're not pulling them out to receive their EL services or their special education services. They all need to receive core instruction. And then what does it look like? So we have districts, the districts that we work with, develop what we call standards of practice. And there are just really those expectations that we want all staff to do and to use. So we have that, so we have them develop the standards of practice for what materials should be used. And so that's going to be evidence-based materials, and also what instructional strategies should be used. And again, we want those to be all steeped in the science of reading. And then those are going to be delivered with a scope and sequence, and those are aligned to standards. Core instruction should also be 90 minutes a day at minimum. So there's lots of research that supports that 90 minutes as a minimum is what it takes to allow kids to make the progress that we need them to make. And then it's the general ed teacher who does this. And what we want to point out here, and I'll talk more about in a little bit, is that we should have whole group instruction and small group instruction to be able to meet kids' needs. We'll use our screening data to kind of then to look at how we're doing with core through a core review meeting process. And we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. But really all these practices, again, are steeped in the science of reading. So let's dive into what we mean by Tier 1 supports with core instruction. And Tier 1 supports equals core instruction equals structured literacy. So this is the example I just gave you. And what we really mean by that is that we're going to use that highly explicit and systematic approach that Beth talked about to teach the 5 pillars in reading: the phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And even deeper than that, we want to make sure that we're teaching all aspects of that reading rope. That's our foundation. So what's also important to understand about structured literacy is it is for all students. We know that it's necessary, absolutely necessary for a portion of our students. So you can see in the red section, there's about 10 to 15% of students who have or maybe have characteristics of dyslexia that they absolutely need a code-based, explicit and systematic approach that's sequenced well and with lots of practice to be able to learn to read. That's critical for those students. Another 40 to 50% also still need to have that explicit and systematic approach to learning to read. But without it, they're going to struggle. So that's a large portion of the population of our students. That's about 60%. That's most of them. Then there's that 35% who pretty much can read with kind of any kind of broad reading instruction. And then another 5% that it's really effortless. They're those kids who, probably started reading when they were 4 years old, and so forth. But those kids are still advantaged by a structured literacy approach. Steve also talked about that it's not going to harm students. We want to make sure that we're doing the best we can to benefit all students. So then what is our hesitation? I think sometimes we have a hesitation around how much phonics instruction to provide or what to do about that piece. But really what research shows us is that alphabetic decoding skills is helpful for all children. And it's crucial for some, but it's not going to be harmful for any kids. It's going to still benefit them. Now, how much we provide them, that's where we need to kind of use our data and our decision making to figure that out. But it's not going to be harmful overall for students. So how do we start to kind of go about this? And how do we look to see, we can start to look at that with our materials and start asking, are our materials aligned with the science of reading? So this is an example of what we call a standard reading protocol. This is from the Tiger Tualatin School District. We also, as we work with districts, have every one of our districts develop a standard reading protocol. And what it contains is what materials for core instruction should be used and also for interventions. And since right now I'm talking about Tier 1, we're just going to look at the core instruction materials. So they use journeys. So every teacher is expected to use journeys. And then they also supplement it with ECRI, the enhanced core reading instruction. So that's what every teacher is expected to do in those grade levels. But we need to start to ask then, we need to observe this and go around and see, is that curriculum consistently used? Is it used across teachers within a grade level or across grade levels? We want to make sure we have consistency there, because if every teacher is using something different, then the kids move up to the next class and they're going to have different holes to fix, and they're not going to have learned. Maybe one teacher spent more time on phonemic awareness, another on phonics. So it's we kind of get that struggle then, and then how to teach them to be more effective. And also it's the instructional routines. So we're teaching them instructional routines one way in one class and a different way in the next grade. That's going to be confusing for students. So that's why it's important to have this consistency. And then another crucial part is we can't just hand staff the core program and say, here you go. We need to make sure they're trained in it, and that we have a process for new staff to be trained as well as they come aboard. And critical, as Beth kind of talked about too, is that coaching and support. It's not just a one-time training, kind of like we're doing today with you, but we know it's continued coaching and support that really makes the difference. So then what is that core reading block actually look like? What does a structured literacy look like in a classroom? And there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's two components. There's whole group instruction, and then there's small group instruction. And so let's focus a little first on the whole group instruction. Typically, that's going to consist of 30 to 45 minutes of that core reading block, which is, again, that minimum of 90 minutes. The amount of time that you spend in whole group is probably going to be determined by how many groups you need for a small group instruction. But what's key to the whole group instruction is that it's focused on grade level instruction. So whatever foundational skills are hit in that grade level, those we want to be focusing those. For example, your primary grades are going to be more focused probably on phonemic awareness and phonics and some fluency, where upper grades would probably be more focused on that fluency and advanced phonics skills, such as multisyllabic words. And then critical as well as the grade level vocabulary and comprehension practices. We want to make sure that all our kids are getting that at grade level so we can keep increasing their knowledge. And so this way they can become stronger readers. Another piece is that to that time is doing some response, writing in response to reading. That's critical as well, as Steve talked about this morning, that we need to be able to make our have that language piece brought into it, and responding to reading as way to and through writing as a way to do that. Typically, we say that the writing process, so if you're using 6 traits or whatever you're using, should occur outside that 90-minute reading block. But writing in response to reading, we definitely want to see that within that reading block. And there are times then, not all core program is perfect. They all have their pros and cons. So sometimes you may need to supplement with agreed upon materials. Again, we need to have that consistency here, that everyone's kind of using the same materials to have that supplementation. So the example with Tiger Twalton's one was the use of ECRI. They wanted to provide more practice for their phonemic awareness and phonics teaching. So they chose that as a way to supplement. But what's critical too is the differentiated targeted skill group instruction. And you can see that we have a little anchor there. And Beth talked about that in the beginning, that's where we really want you to pay attention to, because this is the part that as we work with our districts, it's the part that probably needs the most enhancing to, and really can be the biggest bang for its buck, because it's just so powerful. So typically that small group instruction is going to be between 45 to 60 minutes of your reading block time. Again, kind of it depends on how many groups you have. And typically it might be about 15 minutes per group. And what is maybe different or than maybe typical small group instruction you've done in the past, that's more kind of, we're using a leveled reader and kind of guiding kids through text. This one is really more about, it's based on what skills do those group of students need. So it might be a 4th grade classroom, but you have a group of students who are more reading, still struggling with some simple CVC words and simple phonics skills. So that's where that instruction would need to be. They'll get the grade level skills that they need through that whole group instruction. But we need to start closing the gap. We need to intensify our support during that small group instruction. So this way they can start to gain reading skills. So this small group instruction is not intervention. This is occurring within the reading block. Some of these kids might also need to receive intervention outside of this time. Another important part to make is that the teachers should be meeting with the groups who are most in need more frequently. So there are kids who are proficient and advanced readers might not meet with the teacher every day. You can give them a structure to have dialogue with text and think through text independently. And the teacher can kind of check on them every so often. And again, you might need to supplement the small group materials. Lots of time in the core reading programs, the small group resources that they give you really aren't sufficient to really be able to provide that targeted skill group instruction. So when we know better, we do better. And now you can also see our symbol for, we want to anchor our practices and improve practices, and we really want to consider abandoning some previous practices. It doesn't mean that the previous practices weren't necessarily bad, but we just know a better way to do it now. So we want to kind of be considerate of what we're doing that we can maybe improve upon. One example is word walls versus sound walls. We know the sound spelling cards that come with core programs are critical. They're the ones that are going to help kids to really understand the connection between the sounds and the spellings and helps them to decode those words. So it's really important that we have them up on the displayed where students can see them. And it's really important that we actually use them for instruction, both during the primary grades and whole group instruction and small group instruction. Just posting them and not referring to them isn't going to be an effective practice. Another one just to point out is reading predictable text for practice versus reading decodable text for practice. We want our kids to be able to practice this phonics skills that they're learning. So decodable text is a much more beneficial way to do that. So
I think we'll wait on the poll, Lisa, just because time-wise.
Yep. Okay, no, it'll be Beth.
Yeah, you can actually go back one thing,
Right,
but just we did include this little chart in the file today or in the folder, and it's a really good reflective tool. Not to, I want to be really clear. This is not like a walkthrough checklist thing. What it is the what and the how of structured literacy, and kind of you can use this tool to think through what are our strengths, what are our needs. It might be more knowledge, might be materials, or improve instructional practices, and what might be the first step around kind of your core instruction. So we were going to do a poll about this, but I think we need to keep going. All right, go ahead. So now I'm going to talk about universal screening in Tier 1. So with dyslexia legislation really spreading widely throughout the country, most school systems now have universal screening in place. And probably the options that you have in your district are those first three things. It's very likely they are brief, reliable, and valid. So the question is, though, according to the legislation, sometimes that's only in primary grades, but we encourage people to be giving those screeners through all of elementary, maybe even into 8th grade, to determine the health of your core system, to see keep answering that question: is what we're doing having impact? Are we teaching kids? And then do we understand how the screening data can be slightly diagnostic to really help us plan for what kids need, what supports we need for the whole group of students, for small group instruction, and then really helping us to determine which other kids might need some additional support. So that is really the role of the screening assessments in an MTSS. So once you have that, one of the structures that Oregon ORTIi trains on, that when I came to this organization, I found this to be super impactful and wished that I had this structure in districts I have worked in the past, because a lot of us have meetings around the data, but this one is really specific. Okay, go ahead. A database or a core review meeting is really defined as that as a team, we're using that screening data and some core program data to develop a grade level plan based on what science tells us is effective for all students for their access, engagement, and reading skills. So the questions that we ask at a core review meeting is, what is the health of our core? And when we ask that, we're saying, are we causing learning? Does our instruction have an impact? Those are the questions we want to ask around our data. At this meeting, we look at the whole grade level and create a plan to intensify instruction in an area of need for most of the grade level. During CDL this year, we added the access engagement data to the core review agenda, and many of our districts told us that they plan to keep that as part of the core review agenda, even once we get back to kind of more traditional in-person school. So that, because those things, access and engagement, are important as you're making a plan around core instruction. The other thing we need to do at these meetings is think through who is our core instruction working for and who might it not be working for. So there is a need to disaggregate the data. This might be something, depending on your setting, that may be more of a conversation over years over time or at the building level, but we want to be asking, are we impacting everyone? For example, if we disaggregate our core reading or screening data and to look specifically at students with disabilities, if we know that effective instruction works for students with dyslexia, we would expect to see students with reading-based disabilities improving still. So we don't want to leave anybody out of that high expectation for reading. Okay, and then the last thing at the core, using the screening data really is about looking at who might need tier 2 supports, okay? Do these meetings 3 times a year. The really important thing about this one is that it is essential for preferably everybody, but most of the team at least, to have some really extensive knowledge about the science of reading. And the reason why is probably, go ahead, Lisa, at your team meetings, you probably have in your district some sort of problem-solving model. And it is essential that we know something about the science of reading, because we need to be thinking about what works best at every step of the problem-solving process, because otherwise the plan that we make, as well-intentioned as it is, might be actually undermining what we know about the science of reading and kind of be based on one of those flawed ideas. So for example, you might be at a first grade meeting where they see that their oral reading fluency is really low. And the teachers might say, you know what, we can really improve this if we teach, or if we have kids memorize the list of fry words, you know, certain number of words, it's going to totally make a difference. So maybe they send home a note to parents, please have your kid memorize this list of words. That's really well intentioned, but it's a little bit of a shortcut. Kids need, like we talked about before, they need that work of orthographic mapping. They need to be building those pathways, because reading is not about memorizing what a word looks like. It's about those pathways. And also, it's not really the parent's job to teach them. It's our job. So having somebody at the table during those meetings to say, oh, I'm not sure our plan really, we need to tweak it a little bit because it's not super aligned with what actual reading instruction is about. In the folder that we gave you today, we have some core review agendas. As I said, there are times where when we know better, we do better. So we will be tweaking these agendas a little bit over the next couple of months, and then we'll send them out through our newsletter and on our website. So if you registered for this conference, you'll be getting our newsletter. Okay, go ahead. And speaking of when we know better, we do better, some practices, thinking about core review and data. Like I said in the past, we often just focused on our own classrooms, whereas now we're going to be focusing on all of that grade level data. And we looked at what individual students need. And now we want to look at what do most students need and what's going to give us a big bang for our buck if we intensify one area of instruction. It doesn't mean we're going to abandon everything else, but what do we need to put a little bit of extra effort into? And that idea that in the past, teachers really had to implement these plans on their own. And sometimes, I mean, I've been at these meetings, right? You make a plan and then you write it on a piece of paper and you put it on a pile on your desk and there it stays for months, right? And sometimes you remember to come back to it. When we have a team-based plan, we can coach and support each other and begin to build a culture where peer observation and walkthroughs are kind of that key to instructional improvement. We see that as something we want, and we are supporting each other with that plan and building that collective teacher efficacy. Okay, go ahead. So this would be a good time if you were watching this with a team or having you're going to come back to this with a team to really think through how effective is our tier 1 system for all students. What is it that we really need to invest in to make our tier 1 more impactful? What do we need to anchor in? Which practices should we really anchor in first? And then what do we need to abandon? Okay. So now moving on to tier 2, we told you this is going to be a whirlwind 5 years in 75 minutes. We're not going to make it, but we'll do the best we can. So at core review, we figured out how to intensify in an area of need. And then we also use the screening data to identify which students are going to need an additional layer of support. So go ahead to the next one, Lisa. First, again, we want to come to a common definition because this already came up in the chat, right? If you ask 10 people, what is tier 2 or what is a reading intervention, you're going to get at least 5 different definitions, probably closer to 10. So we find that you don't have to adopt our definition, but you really need to have a common definition of these terms within your school district, or it gets really confusing for people about, what's small group instruction? What is an intervention? Is this an evidence-based intervention? Does this intervention count, right? You've been to those meetings where people ask, does this count as an intervention? So we want to be really clear what it is. So, yep, all kids receive core. All kids receive small group instruction in core, and some kids are going to need even more than that. Typically, it's about 20% of the class. If you have more capacity than that, great, but most systems do not. And this is how we are defining a reading intervention: targeted supplemental intervention program that incorporates evidence-based instructional practices that is matched to intensity of student need and delivered with fidelity. So we're really defining it as a program because those programs are designed to increase the rate of growth, to close the gap to peers. Those programs are still based in the science of reading, but they're even more explicit, more targeted, give more opportunities to respond, and more practice in text. Where does this happen? It sort of depends on your setting, but a really important piece should be, does the person who's teaching the reading interventions, whether it's a teacher, a licensed teacher, or a highly trained instructional assistant, does that person have good relationships with kids? Because that's an important piece of this too. And they need to have training in the sciences of reading as well. One thing Lisa's going to talk more about assessment, but one thing I did want to add here is recently we have added student perception data to that, to the kinds of data that you're going to look at when you're talking about interventions. And that really is about, how does the student feel about the intervention? Do they feel supported? Do they even know why they're going to this reading intervention? Do they know the goal of what they're working towards? Do they know the small steps that they need to accomplish in order to become a reader? And how do they feel about that? So that's just an aside of something that we have added fairly recently. Okay, go ahead. And so the standardized interventions that you're going to adopt, again, should be on a standardized reading protocol so that we can coach and support them across the district, train, coach, and support. And that training, whether it's for IAs or classroom teachers or specialists, whoever, that training should, in the program, should include information about the science of reading, because otherwise, unless we do that, we fall back onto those habits of things we used to know or the things that we used to do, and might say to a kid who's struggling with a word, let's look at the picture, or let's just look at the first letter and take a guess, or I wonder what that word could be. Those are the practices that we need to get rid of. And unless we have explicitly explained to people why those are not aligned with the science of reading, we fall back on those because we used to do those practices. And so we need to move past them. Okay. So using that same chart, you can kind of look at the intervention programs that you have and say, are they still based in structured literacy? Are they based in the 5 pillars of reading? Caveat to that is often these interventions for word reading are not, they don't have as much vocabulary and comprehension in them. And that is another reason why core instruction is so important, and why continuing to have interactive read alouds in core is so important. We need to be building knowledge. We need to be building vocabulary and those things across the day, because the intervention programs tend to focus more on some of those foundational skills, because that's typically where kids need more support. This may be a different situation. If you have kids who need ELD support, you will want to have things in your menu that support kids for all the tier 2 supports that they need. Okay, go ahead. When we know better, we do better. And we have said that again and again. So in the past, like I said, some people would have said, oh, I did an intervention, and they maybe found something in a drawer. There was something on the back shelf that said it was going to be good for kids who needed to learn whatever this thing is. When we have evidence-based programs designed to close gaps, to help, we have those, and we train and support people who are delivering them. That's a more improved practice. Another thing I wanted to point out is sometimes in the past, when parents were concerned about their child's reading, especially in the early grades, we might have said, oh, it's okay, we have time. Let's just wait for your child to acquire some reading skills. They just haven't acquired it yet. To be clear, nobody acquires reading, right? They have to be taught reading. So when we have those conversations with parents, we can say, this is what I'm doing in core. This is what I'm doing in small group instruction. These are the skills I'm working on with your child. Let's see how that explicit and systematic instruction in those areas of need work out before, yes, I'm concerned too, and these are the things I'm doing. So, and keep those parents and caregivers informed about the progress. Okay, go ahead. Again, I don't think we're going to have time for our poll. But Lisa is going to now talk a little bit more about assessment in Tier 2.
So there's this quote that found that I thought was just a nice summary of what kind of to start out this section. And you can read it, but I want to point out here it's that unbiased decision making, which is huge. So we need to use assessments that are available that will help us make those unbiased decisions. Another thing about the Tier 2 assessment, it's going to be grounded in those 5 pillars. And typically it's going to be grounded in those earlier skills, more those foundational skills of phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency, because those are typically what students who are receiving intervention need. So, but that doesn't mean you never assess vocabulary and comprehension. That'd be probably just more something you'd be assessing during core. So here's just kind of a list. Beth had these in the yellow document as well, but I'll talk to you a little bit more about them. But there are 2 meetings that happen in Tier 2, and they're called intervention placement meetings, which are how we place kids in interventions, and intervention review meetings. So an intervention placement meeting is just who will receive those interventions, and then it also is helping us go further than that. It's helping us to look at what's the right intervention they should receive. We want to make sure it's matched to their need. When Read Naturally came out, a lot of people bought that and were using it. So, but really that's a fluency-based program to develop kids' fluency. And a lot of the kids that were having used Read Naturally were actually kids who needed more instruction in phonics. So that would be an example of an intervention that's not matched to students' need. And we also need to use some of our Tier 2 assessment data to determine at what intensity level do kids need support? Is it more kind of at that more strategic level they need support, or is it really more at that intensive level that they need support? Then an intervention review meeting occurs. We have those occur to look at the progress of students who are receiving interventions. So because we want to know if the intervention's working or not. So something that we might do that's maybe a little unique that we want you to look at is that, is oftentimes when we have an intervention group, we're trying to see if students are making progress. We look at each individual student to see if they're making progress. The way that we suggest to do it as a first step is actually just to first look at the group of students who are in that intervention first. So for example, maybe you have a group of students who are getting reading mastery. There's 4 kids and you notice that 3 of them are not making progress. That's most of the group. So that might make us have the hypothesis that something else is going on. Maybe they weren't placed at the right level in that intervention, or maybe the person delivering that intervention, reading mastery, didn't get training in how to teach it. So there's broader issues that we can look at first. That would be a more efficient way to solve to benefit kids than looking at kid by kid by kid. Yes, there might be circumstances where everything is done as well as we want it to be, and those kids truly do need more support. But typically, when most of the group is not making progress, it's more what we call that group problem. We want to solve it for the group rather than individual students. And then we also want to look kind of to see for whom our intervention is actually working for and who are they not working for. So when you're reviewing your interventions and you see, you can kind of disaggregate it to look at to see, well, it looks like most of our white students are making progress in their interventions, but our Hispanic students are not. So that's really important information for us to examine to see how we can better support our Hispanic learners. And then the point of any time you actually review something or analyze something or look at something is to make a plan to make it work better. So if we are needing to address the needs of a group or to intensify supports for individual students, we need to make sure that those changes and enhancements are aligned with the science of reading. We don't have time to use those practices that are ineffective, even though we think they might be helpful. We really need to make sure that they're based in the science of reading. So the data that you use to place kids into your interventions, to make sure they're in the right intervention to close the gap to their peers, or you can use your screening data to do that because they usually have some subtests. So like DIBELS would have a nonsense word fluency. You can look at that to see that students might have some phonics needs. And then you can use a diagnostic or a placement test, and placement tests typically come with interventions to place the student into the appropriate intervention at the right intensity level. Sorry. And then we need to look to see, are we actually closing the gap? Is that intervention actually working? So the data we want to use for that, or to look at, primarily we're going to be using that progress monitoring data that we collect. Important parts to that, though, is that we need to make sure that we're progress monitoring the students at the right level. Again, if it's a 4th grade student who is struggling to read, their fluency is low, their accuracy is low in a 4th grade passage, progress monitoring them in a 4th grade passage might not be the most helpful for us just to see if our intervention supports are working for that student. Occasionally, we might have to back down to different levels to make sure that what we can see if what we're doing is sensitive enough to pick up the progress or lack of progress that student's making. And so then also there's other things we want to use, multiple data sources. So then we can also use the intervention programs typically have checkouts that we can use too. And that's an important thing to see because we want to make sure that students are learning what we're teaching them. And that's what helps do that. Whereas the progress monitoring tool typically helps us to know if what we're teaching is being generalized. And then in general, we just want to see, are you seeing any improvements in spelling and reading in class too? And typically interventions to help make decisions around whether they're working or not, it's typically helpful first to look at, is the student accurate? And then are they fluent in it? And then eventually we want to make it that automaticity where they can just do it like that and they don't even have to think about it, that it's truly cemented in their learning. So a way that we kind of frame the intervention review meeting is we use the problem solving process, and kind of Beth showed that earlier, and it really focuses on what is happening, kind of like what's the problem, why is it happening, what we should do about it, and how well it worked. So we use a framework we call ISIL, and the joke we always use is we don't want to call it LICE because that sounds bad for many reasons. So the ISIL stands for Instruction, Curriculum, Environment, and the Learner. And what the science of reading helps us to, all that research helps us to understand is that we can do so much with our instruction and curriculum, and PBIS helps us to understand with the environment piece to help support students. Where oftentimes we think the difficulties lie within the student, but it's really our actions that make the difference. So we really need to make sure that the people who are involved with these meetings are really, and really all staff are steeped in knowledge about effective reading practices based in the science of reading. So here's an example of it. And this is also in our resources. And then just again, some previous practices for best practices or improved practices here. So one kind of a important part that I want to mention as we are running out of time, that in the past, we kind of had just the individual teachers kind of determining if a student was making adequate progress or not. But really with this approach, it's a team. That's the grade level team, and specialists and administrators should be there too. But they're really using a structured process to look at that. And we have them apply decision rules around that. So it's not an I think, I believe, I feel decision. We're actually using some guiding principles to help us do that. So again, you can reflect on your system and when you have more time.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure. We kind of knew this would happen. Hey, Jamie, can you make sure you have that survey queued up, please? We weren't sure we were going to have time to get to tier 3 and pretty much assumed that we wouldn't. And so I was just sort of thinking, what is it that I want to say about tier 3 in 30 seconds or less? And that really is that a tier 3 level of support is really when you recognize that what the reading interventions that you have already done and you have done with fidelity and they have worked for most of the kids in the group, and you've made some little adjustments and tweaks, when you're still not seeing the growth that you need, that is kind of when you enter into this sort of tier 3 level of support. It's really important that you have these what we call individual problem solving meetings with the group, and that you are bringing it's like I say here, it's the all hands on deck approach to providing the support that the student needs across the day, and that you don't need to have an IEP to get this level of support. It is that as a school, we're going to give you the support that you need in order for you to make growth in reading, the child to get that. So I think the other thing I want to say about that is, in the past, I don't know if this is how it is in your school, if you were concerned about a kid, you'd write their name down on a list and you'd be assigned a date to come to a meeting and we would talk about the kid. This way, we have, through this whole process with the intervention placement, intervention review, and more intervention review to see if it's working, there are decision rules that determine when a student gets to this individual problem solving level. Evidence-based interventions have already been tried. We know that they should have worked. So we need to come up with a different plan, and that plan, the outcome isn't, well, we need to get this kid into special ed. That might be what happens, but really that's not necessarily our first desired outcome. Our desired outcome is a comprehensive plan to support the student and continue to improve their reading outcome, whatever it takes. And so that, I think, for me, was a huge shift in IPS, and it takes a long time. The other thing we provided is some supports for you from the National Center on Intensive Instruction. Okay, Lisa, that was like maybe 1 minute for tier 3.
Yes, but that just to kind of sorry, plus on what Beth said, the reason why we really have those intervention programs in that tier 2 level is, like Beth said, we want to make sure that we're using an evidence-based program there, because if that doesn't work, then we really truly know, okay, we need to then really customize the intervention for the student. So here's just again a reminder about, this is a good thing for your teams to look at what you need to invest in, and that's not just funding, it's your building educator knowledge around the science of reading and ORTIi, MTSS, anchoring in those practices that we know work and then abandoning those ones that don't. And everyone has a role in that: teachers, school leaders, administrators, and parents and caregivers. So just here are some other resources you can look at that are about the science of reading. And you're always welcome to ask us questions. Our emails are there, and our website has a lot of information as well. And so we will have this presentation, it's recorded, and in our, you'll be getting an email for the folder for the link.